Hello and welcome. I'm Jordan Soto. I will be your host for today's virtual program, Energizing Tomorrow with MicroSeismic. We're so excited that you have joined us today. In case you didn't know, there are more virtual talks coming your way. All you need to do is follow along to MicroSeismic's LinkedIn. You'll see all of the virtual talks that are coming up. And like I said, you're not going to want to miss these. Especially not today's. Today's session is monetizing and monitoring your CCUS asset, a pathway to success. We have a few housekeeping items just before we get started. First off, all participants are muted, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. You can submit your questions at any point during any of the speakers' presentations in the Q&A section. So right up there next to chat, you can't use the chat feature, but you can submit a question. We definitely want to hear what you have to say. We will get to those questions at the last portion of this virtual talk, the last 20 minutes. And we'll go over another way how you can submit questions once we get to that point. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce our speakers for today's program. First, we have Zach Liu, Director of CCUS Subsurface for Harveststone Low Carbon Partners. Zach will show us how to make money and prove it's a real enterprise with a solid case study. We're really excited about that one. And Andrea Crook, CEO of Optisize Solutions. Hey, Andrea, thanks for the wave. She'll explain how to validate in the ground using active seismic without breaking the bank. That's the key part of that. Last but not least, we have Greg Matlock, Global Energy and Resource Tax Leader at EY. Greg will reveal how to make money by highlighting how to steer clear of those costly penalties while meeting requirements on both sides. So let's get started with Zach. He's going to kick us off. Zach, please take the floor.
Okay, thanks, Jordan, for the introduction. So I'm going to talk a little bit, give a little bit short talk about some of the projects we're working, and then we can answer some questions. So before I go talk about the project, I'd like to talk a little bit about myself, and this is the fitting in the big picture of energy transition. If you did not know, actually the world's first well deeper than 1,000 meters were actually a salt well. That drilling was actually drilled in Zigong, China in 1835. So they were drilling for, not for oil and gas, they were drilling for salt, for brine. And there's associated natural gas with that. So the people there, they actually evaporate the brine with the natural gas and make salt for the inland. And this was actually about 4 miles from my childhood home. So from this, we can see that being able to drill into the deep earth, understand subsurface is very critical, even way before the oil and gas age. And I think that will be very important for our future as well. And talking about the importance of energy, this is a natural bus in my hometown in 1994. When I was a child, I rode on those type of buses. Those buses are powered by natural gas. They're not by compressed natural gas. They're actually powered by gas in basically a gas bag, maybe about 20-30 psi on top of a bus. Those bars doesn't run very fast, but at least they provide a little bit energy for the people there, so that when I was a kid, I can ride this bus to school. I can ride this bus to my soccer practice, and I can definitely see that having energy that definitely change people's life and improve the quality of life. So in the broader scheme of things, what we do, the energy transition, CCUS, oil and gas, I think we should all be very proud that we provide the energy to help to improve the quality of life, at the same time decarbonize the world. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the company I work for. Harveststone is we own and operate 3 ethanol plants in the Midwest area. 2 of them, the first 2, Blue Flame and the North Dakota Spirit, they are in North Dakota, and in the IBEC plant is in Indiana. Each of the plant produced about, you can see on the about 70 million gallon of ethanol fuel from corn from the nearby area, and also in the process of making those ethanols, we produce about 200,000 tons of CO2 for each plant. So our company has been taking the initiative to try to decarbonize our ethanol fuel by embracing CCS technology. For the first plant on the very left, the North Dakota Bluefin plant, we were one of the very few ethanol plant in US having operating CCS. We are CCS operation starting 2023. We have been running that for about 2 years. We sequester about 200,000 tons of CO2 every year. For the other two plants, we are actually in a very advanced development phase for both of them. And particularly for the Indiana IBEC plant, we have recently submitted a Class 6 permit to store the CO2 in the area nearby. This is what we call CCS, near site CCS project. So we do not have a very long pipeline. All of our storage sites are very close to our capture point, usually within a few miles. And this is just a picture, basically highlight some of the factors we have mentioned for the project. For the Bluefin project, we actually started injection on October 28th, 2023. That was the third Class 6 injection US, 200,000 tons of CO2 injection. So by the time we finish this panel, we will be store about 40 tons of CO2. And the storage formation is in a very regional pervasive Ulian sandstone reservoir, Broom Creek, at about 4,700 feet. I mentioned we have a very short pipeline. And I would like to mention that with the CCS, our ethanol producer from this plant has reached close to carbon zero. So that's one of the very few truly carbon zero ethanol fuel, which is very competitive in the no carbon fuel market. And also we complete our tax equity financing for this project. So obviously our project benefited from capture CO2 from low carbon, from low cost source like ethanol plant, and we are very fortunate to have a nearby geology which we can make it work. And by having near site CCS storage, we were able to get the support from the nearby landowners and to get a nearby community support. And obviously, for those of you familiar with the Class 6 permit, North Dakota is the first state in US has a Class 6 primacy, which definitely helps to having the local regulators permitting those Class 6 wells. And talking about Class 6 permitting, obviously, talking about CCS, obviously, is very important to be able to having a very strong MRV program. Among them, monitoring induced seismicity is one of the items which all need to address. And this is what you are seeing here is hypothetical proposed potential statewide monitoring network in North Dakota to monitor induced seismicity for the few CCS project in North Dakota. Supposedly could be managed by ERSA because they have the local expertise, and also they have a great trust of the public in North Dakota. And by sharing the costs and the resources, that will help to reduce the monitoring cost. And this is the plan which is currently under study. Talking about, I think Greg later probably can talk more about this, but I will mention that being able to monetize the tax credit generated by CCS projects is very important. Our project generated something called 45Q tax credit, which is $85 per ton. But we cannot directly use the tax credit because we do not have that much tax liability. So what we did is we were able to enter into a tax equity deal with Bank of America in September, basically to transfer those tax credit to Bank of America, and in exchange for basically we sold those tax credit to them. In order to do that, our project had to go under very extensive review from their technical experts, from their financial experts, to make sure our capture plan can perform, can continually capture, our pipeline can continually transport, and our storage site can continually inject and keep the CO2 in the subsurface. For those of you who work with banks, that tends to be very conservative. So we actually had to demonstrate everything in very glorious detail to convince them that our business plan is solid, and also we also have to get a recapture insurance for the CO2 we stored on our site. But with that, we were able to close that in September, so that this is actually one of the first type of CCS tax equity deal under the new IRA. So that kind of important or has some significance and made to the Wall Street Journal on that day. So I have a screen capture of that article on Wall Street Journal about. So I think with tax equity, we demonstrate that if you have a solid CCS project and profitable, we can actually try to make a CCS bankable. This is the last slide I want to present. It's actually a little bit dated, but I think it's interesting that in 2023, this is a study done by BCG, and they estimated that at that time, solar and wind were basically more profitable than CCS on a risk-adjusted return basis. But they estimated in 2020, by the time of 2025, CCS probably will be on par with wind and solar, and they expect the CCS to become more profitable compared with wind and solar in 2030 and 2035. Looking back, their prediction seems like it's actually pretty accurate. I think nowadays, with a new policy, with a progress in CCS, I think actually CCS is getting there to be pretty much on par in terms of profitability with a wind and solar project, and hopefully we will be able to see a CCS project moving towards a more profitable trend in the coming years. Thank you. I'll pass the microphone to Andrea.
All right, everybody can hear me now. I've unmuted myself. Thank you, Zach. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the subsurface. As an introduction, sorry, let me just get this going. My name is Andrea Crook. I'm the CEO of OptiSeis, and my background is in geophysics. And our company, OptiSeis, focuses on subsurface imaging and analytics. We began in oil and gas and have expanded into all areas of energy that require subsurface imaging, from critical minerals through carbon capture and storage to geothermal and nuclear waste management. So what we provide is methods for high-resolution subsurface imaging. And our main focus when we started the company was on seismic acquisition and design and consulting, but we've since expanded into technology development, such as our containment and conformance seismic, as well as EcoSeis. And these are the two technologies that I'm going to be talking to you about today, as they can be directly applied to CCUS projects. We also provide services such as VSP processing, which is important for measurement, monitoring, and verification of the CO2 in storage. And we have a software division. So I'm going to start out talking a bit about EcoSeis and where the idea for this alternative sampling method for imaging the subsurface came from. Back in 2020, up here in Canada, we were looking at ways to reduce the environmental impact of acquiring seismic. And these images that you can see here some of them are from winter in Canada. You can see the seismic cut lines. And we're exploring very shallow, so it involves cutting a lot of trees. In fact, on some of these programs, up to 25% of the total forest area can be affected. And this doesn't just impact areas in Canada. This happens all around the world, from South America to Australia. So the solution that we started working on was EcoSeis, and we began working on this with industry partners and both federal and provincial funding agencies. Phase 1 involved decimation processing tests and geophysical evaluations. And then upon successful completion of these, we moved to technical field trials in phase 2. And the collaborative approach of the project, which included over 30 different participants, led to the project winning the 2024 Global Energy Show Collaborative Trendsetter Award. And then last year, we moved into the final phase of the project with multiple field trials, including the first international test. We expect the technology, which is available as both a software product and a service, will be fully commercial next year. So the main focus of the project was to reduce the land footprint. And when we started this, our goal was to reduce the land footprint by 35% or more, all while maintaining subsurface resolution. Because without good data quality, it doesn't matter how much surface reduction you have in footprint, you're not achieving the purpose of the seismic program. And then for any new technology, in fact, any technology at all, whatever we do in the field needs to be done safely and efficiently. And what we're talking about today, it needs to be done cost effectively. Because the reality is that in carbon capture, it doesn't have the same cash flow and ROI as oil and gas projects. So whatever we do for exploration in carbon capture or for monitoring needs to be done very cost effectively. So I'm excited to share that even though the initial target was 35% reduction, we've actually achieved up to a 55% reduction in land footprint. And this has other environmental benefits as well. In areas with trees, it can include reducing use of seismic cut lines and helping sustain wildlife populations by significantly reducing the amount of habitat impacted by seismic programs. The other area that we looked at was emissions reduction. So in areas with trees, there's a significant reduction in biomass decomposition, but also the more efficient operations can lead to reduced direct emissions. And then in Canada, we're very concerned about peatland compaction because when we compact peatland, that can also create methane emissions. And one of the points I want to make here is that with carbon capture, we're trying to reduce emissions. So whatever technology we're using in the field to explore and then monitor these storage sites, we want to make sure that the emissions generated from those activities are as low as possible. So here are some of the results from some of the initial phases of the project. I'm showing a seismic section as well as a gather because part of the work is to ensure that we still have good data for pre-stack analyses. If you're interested in learning more, please do reach out. We'd be happy to go into technical details with you. We've also published numerous articles in First Break in the Leading Edge. And as you can see, the technology has delivered comparable data to conventional seismic methods. We've done some of the validation has include processing tests. We've looked at decimation studies where we've examined up to 35 different types of geometries to figure out which ones give the most footprint reduction and the best data quality. Those data sets have been taken through interpretation and inversion. And as I mentioned, we've done multiple field trials as well. We're currently halfway through phase 3 and have completed some commercial testing in the field under varying terrain, proving that this is safe to operate in all sorts of terrain. The technology can also be used with any type of seismic equipment. It's not restricted to one specific type. The next step, which is probably of most interest to all of you in the carbon capture space, is we're going to be doing a test for data quality at a CCUS reservoir. So in finishing off, I'm going to spend a bit of time on specifically the carbon capture side of the technology, and that's the cost-effective measurement, monitoring, and verification of these programs. The most important point is to do this properly, you need a baseline. Whether that baseline is a 2D or 3D baseline, MicroSeismic or VSP, and I'd highly encourage you to acquire baselines in all of these. Without a baseline, you're not going to be able to do the verification of how much has been injected. So the way that we approach this from a cost-effective perspective is we look at a staged technology deployment. And the most important first technology that you're going to have on the ground well in advance of injecting any CO2 is microseismic. So this may be a couple of sensors, it may be a very broad array across your entire area, but that kind of forms your first line of defense to ensure that everything is stable in the reservoir. So we look at this from kind of the phased approach where you have microseismic and that's continuously monitoring, and then if everything's within tolerance, if you see an event, that's just kind of the loop you keep going through. And then if microseismic shows that there is an issue or you've hit a certain time in your project where you do need to take a time lapse, the next step is your VSP, and this could be done with traditional geophones or more cost effectively with DAS fiber in the well. And often the baseline VSP and then the monitor VSP is all that is needed in the first few years of the project because the plume remains relatively close to the well. And then as the plume is expanding, you may get to the point where you're going to either at the very end do a full time-lapse 4D baseline to show how much has been captured and all as you're closing down your project, or in some jurisdictions you may be required to do this periodically. And this is where the EcoSeis technology can come in because it can reduce the cost of both the baseline as well as the monitor. And what's really interesting in some of the testing that we've done is if you do have a conventional baseline, you don't need to be repeating your monitor exactly. There are some advanced processing algorithms now that can allow you to acquire your monitor survey much sparser and with alternative geometries and get a very good time-lapse response. So that's everything that I wanted to share with you today, and I look forward to answering any of your questions. I'll pass it over now to the next speaker.
Perfect, thanks. I'm going to take control here, and nice to see everybody. The exit spotlight. Okay. Here we go. So in this next section, I mean, you just heard from Andrea about some of the seismic and the comments around the plume movement. I think we're absolutely exceptional. And then Zach earlier on how he's been able to turn his project into money. So we're going to spend the next couple of minutes, I think we're ahead of schedule a little bit, on when you get into a carbon capture project, how do we take the activities that we're doing? How do we turn those into money? And then what is the role of all the great stuff you've already heard on today's talk, right? About the measurement, the reporting, verification. Because as you would expect, the validation portion of this and the data portion of this is fundamental to making sure that these projects work. And as we'll talk about here in a second, fundamental to how you get financed on these projects. One thing to note, so let's start on monetization, then we'll flip over to the next slide here in a second on verification and validation. So it's important to have maybe a little bit of a history on kind of how we got to where we're at today. So 45Q, and Zach mentioned that earlier, so that's a tax credit for the capture and qualified use or sequestration of carbon oxide, so either carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide under current law. Right, so that is a tax credit. Tax credits, as a general matter, are dollar for dollar offsets against income tax. So if you owed the government at the end of the year $100 in taxes, but you had a $10 tax credit, you keep $10 in your pocket, you only need to write a check for $90, right? So it's a dollar for dollar offset against income taxes. 45Q, the provision that was mentioned earlier, was put in place in 2008. For about a 10-year period, it really didn't have a whole lot of widespread applicability because there weren't really any rules implementing it. And so you did see projects in this space, but they were mostly balance sheet financed, large oil company type transactions where I didn't need third-party capital, right? To get third-party capital, you need rules that are easy to implement, and you can have a clear line of sight to how you turn these things into money. 2018, there was a change, material change, got rid of a bunch of kind of headache provisions in 45Q. There still weren't any implementing regulations. Those came final in 2021. 2022, you had the Inflation Reduction Act, which Zach mentioned earlier or at the beginning with his is a tax equity deal right after that Inflation Reduction Act. And then obviously over the past 2 months, we've had HR1 or the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which increased, improved 45Q in certain respects. So you've had kind of this history, right, of maybe 17 years of legislative developments. think it's the only tax credit that has bicameral bipartisan support, and it's gotten better in every turn, regardless of who's in charge of the White House or of Congress. Okay, important to note, and that history kind of flavors this a little bit, is before the Inflation Reduction Act, how I turned credits into money was somewhat difficult. I basically had two options. If I generated a tax credit, I could offset my own income taxes, but a lot of times in early stages, developers spend a lot of money, right? Because they're getting projects up and off the ground. They have a lot of CapEx and OpEx, and they're not really going to be in a tax-paying position because they have a lot of deductions. And so if I generate a tax asset that doesn't have current benefit, right? I can't offset my current taxes, it's worth less. And so before the Inflation Reduction Act, my only other option was actually what Zach did, right? Was a tax equity deal. I got to find someone else who values that tax credit more than I do because they can use it. And then we enter into a joint venture, and there's a way that we can share the tax attributes so that the tax equity partner gets what they want, I get cash, and everybody's happy. But that's a finite capital pool, right? Most of the tax equity kind of supply pools, it's about a $20 to $22 billion a year industry, and it's mostly for solar, wind, now battery storage. A little bit for exceptional projects like Zach, you get tax equity. Inflation Reduction Act opened up additional liquidity options. So under current law, you can now sell your tax credit. So if you can't use it, you could sell it in the open market to an unrelated party for cash. And that cash you get is tax-free. You could also get a direct pay refund. So it's a 5-year refund from the government. That says if you had taxes due and owing, you may be able to get a refund from the government. So number of different options. Why is that important now? If you're in a project like this anywhere in the value chain, it's important to understand what the economic rights and entitlements are, the levers, right? Because let's take a simple carbon capture project, say it's connected to an ethanol plant, and my business comes in, I attach equipment to that plant, I capture the molecule, I move the molecule, and I put the molecule downhole, right? There's often going to be a bunch of different parties in a transaction like that. You have the emitter, the owner of the ethanol plant. You're likely going to have a carbon capture company. You're likely going to have a transport company, right? Someone, depending on how far you got to move it, maybe it's a historic pipeline company, et cetera. And then you're going to have a downhole provider, right? And then you're going to have a financing partner, either tax equity like Zach's, or some other strategic investor that's going to put money in the project. As a foundational requirement to any of those working is we have to understand what the pool of economics are. Because if I'm a bank and I'm going to lend against a project like this, what am I lending on? I'm not lending on the sale of widgets or a sale of products because there is no product. Again, in a base case of me just taking a molecule, moving it, and putting it downhole. I'm lending against a tax credit, largely. And so making sure that the tax credit meets the requirements, that you measure at the point of capture, you verify at the point of injection, which we'll talk about in a second, is fundamental to the overall project economics. The other piece that's interesting is it's not just tax credits. Depending on exactly what type of project you're working on or is at play, there may be things like voluntary carbon offsets, VCUs, VCMs, carbon credits. Those also say the word credit, but they're not tax credits, right? So those don't offset income taxes. They are a market instrument that if you find a willing buyer, you may be able to sell. So there's carbon offsets, there's tax credits, there's state regimes, like low carbon fuel standards credits, other cap and trade credits, and there's a bunch of states that have come up with their own types of regimes. There's adjustments and fees throughout the value chain of these contracts, up and down, depending on what happens or value of certain economic rights and entitlements. And there's a variety of cost structures. So understanding exactly how am I going to turn this into money? Am I going to sell credits? Am I going to find an investor? Do I get tax equity? There's a plethora of options here on how you can monetize. I say all that just to say it is very important to understand how you're going to monetize, because that's going to dictate your diligence, your documentation, and your support. So if I'm selling a credit, that's a different risk profile than if I'm using it against my own return, right? If I have a carbon offset, that may have a different data requirement as opposed to me just trying to meet the 45Q technical definitions to get my tax credit. So step one is figuring out what's the kind of the closed system of economics in one of my projects? What's it made up of, right? What are all the data and reporting and validation requirements that are needed for those different rights and entitlements? Right? It's going to be vastly different for a low carbon fuel standard credit versus a tax credit. and then making sure that everyone in the value chain and all my contracts appropriately reflect the obligations to provide data, the obligations to provide verification or validation, the right to cooperate and be involved in some of those decisions, and that it's crystal clear throughout the document. So the method of monetization is going to dictate a bunch of those. All right, so let's flip over now to some of the validation issues. As I just mentioned, key to ensuring that the applicable tax credits, and this can be expanded beyond tax credits into carbon offsets, is making sure that we get the right validation, right? So for 45Q, so if we just sit for a second just on the tax credit, to qualify for the tax credit, in part, there's a whole host of other obligations, but the captured carbon oxides must be two things: measured at the point or the source of capture, and then verified at the point of disposal, injection, or utilization. Right? That's the fundamental requirement on how to make sure I'm getting the right data. When I look at how do I do that, right? How do I make sure that I'm measuring at the source of capture and verifying at the point of disposal? On paper, those words seem really straightforward. There shouldn't be a problem. I will say anecdotally that there were rumors that before 2021, half the tax credits were denied because of lack of appropriate data around verification and the validation of the downhole component. Right? People just didn't either put the right information, didn't know what information to put, had lack of support and substantiation. So if we back up a second and say, well, that sounds bad, right? If any of my credits don't get respected by the IRS, that seems like that'd be a problem. You're absolutely right, right? If I have a project that I'm capturing a molecule, moving the molecule, putting the molecule downhole, and the main source, or in some projects, only source of project economics is a tax credit, having certainty that those tax credits are going to be respected by the IRS is of paramount importance, right? And that's going to be from your lenders, whether that's construction finance, permanent finance, equity partners, capture companies, transport companies, downhole service providers, et cetera, right? This whole ecosystem is going to be relying on making sure these tax credits, for most projects, are going to be respected in what level of certainty. So getting this right is really, really important. So how do we deal with this on the downhole side? For enhanced oil and natural gas recovery projects, right? There's three methods. If you back up and say, well, how do I get this 45Q? You got to do two things: capture the oxide and then do something good with it. On the do something good with it side, there's three methods: permanently sequester it in downhole storage, that's option one; use it in enhanced oil and natural gas recovery and permanently sequester it, that's option two; or option three is utilize it in an approved commercial manner. The market is about 99% of those first two, right? Either permanent sequestration or enhanced oil or natural gas recovery plus sequestration. Right now, for many projects, not all projects, to get the downhole component on permanent sequestration, generally people are looking at a UIC Class 6 well and compliance around subpart RR. So it's the EPA rules on how you satisfy the compliance of making sure the molecules goes downhole and stays downhole. For enhanced oil or natural gas recovery, you got two choices. You can either meet the compliance threshold under that subpart RR from the EPA, or you could satisfy it under what's called the ISO standard, which is a little more lenient, different than the subpart RR. So when we look at how do we prove compliance, how do we prove this validation, we have to look at, well, what regime am I in? That's part one. I also have to look back to the prior slide in our earlier discussion. How am I turning this thing into money, and what information do they need? Right? There could be some things, I've seen this happen just a couple of times, where I had a strategic partner or a finance partner that had some very specific information that they needed on the downhole component for environmental other reasons. And so we have to make sure that in all my contracts, I understand who needs what, exactly what do they need, how do I report it, how do I verify it, how do I validate it, and how can I ensure that that turns into money. We got to figure out how we're turning this into money, and then what kind of reporting regime we're under. To throw a little bit of a wrench, and then I'll wrap up here because I think we're getting back on schedule. On September 12th, the EPA proposed to permanently remove its GHG RPs, so it's Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. Okay, so there is a public hearing on that. I think it's October 1st. Comments are due to the EPA, I believe, by November 3rd. And why are we saying this on a call related to carbon capture? Well, one of the risks there is that if these GHG reporting programs eliminate subpart RR, or the method in which these projects, carbon capture projects, verify that the molecule is going and staying downhole, how do I make sure that I'm in compliance from a 45Q tax credit perspective? And so making sure, and I know there's coalitions, there's working groups, there's comment letters flooding and going to the IRS right now, to Treasury, and to the EPA, and saying, hey, no matter what we do to ease the regulatory burden, which is a policy choice right now, we need to make sure that there's sufficient guidance in place so the projects, carbon capture projects, know how do I prove that this molecule is going downhole and staying downhole. So my full expectation is you're going to see some guidance come out. I don't think we're going to be left in the spot just because of the both sides of the aisle support on carbon capture. I doubt you're going to be left in a spot with no guidance. But when focusing on the validation, the MRV side of the house, it's important to know that those rules or potential rules are going to be out there. All right, with that, I think we're getting back close to time. Jordan, I think maybe I'm passing back to you.
Thank you so much, Greg. I mean,
Yeah.
wonderful, wonderful presentations and conversations across the board for all of our speakers. Zach, Andrea, Greg, thank you so much. You can keep your cameras on. We are now entering into the Q&A portion of today's Energizing Tomorrow virtual talk. This is an interactive session. We do want to hear from you. We have a Q&A tab at the very top. You can go right to that. You can publish your question. If you do post a question and it's posted within the Q&A, just note that your name will be allocated to that. If you react to any of the people's questions, that will also show your name as well. If you'd like to raise your hand and speak, you can do so. We'll unmute you and you can ask your question. So the questions have started coming in, and unsurprisingly, Zach, you are first up on our question list here. So this ask comes from one of our attendees. They say, Harvestone has successfully monetized a CCS project. In your view, how critical is MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, if you don't know, to enabling that success?
Absolutely important. Thanks for the question. I think Greg kind of mentioned on that. The whole point of being able to generate the tax credit relies on that you have a solid MRV plan, which needs to be approved by IRS, needs to be reported every year, needs to be kept in good shape, and make sure prove that the CCS CO2 we capture and store in the subsurface stay there. And also, we need a good MRV plan to demonstrate to the potential tax credit buyers or the tax equity partners that we are being able not only be able to generate the tax credit and also be able to insure those credits just in case that if things goes wrong, which I'm not saying you will, but if we have a good MRV plan, good technical execution of a CCS project, we should be able to keep the CO2 in the subsurface in the event of if some CO2 get out of the zone, should be able to detect that early and fix that early. So again, this all depends on all kinds of MRV technologies, which has been mentioned by Andrea in her presentation. I will not repeat. So yeah, just in short, MRV is absolutely important for CCS project.
This next question comes from Parth. They want to know, is there a platform where the CDR credits can be traded with other potential buyers?
Sure, maybe I'll hit that one, Jordan. So, and for the audience, so that's the carbon dioxide removal. So that's the carbon offsets or carbon credit point of the value chain, right? So not the tax credits, right? Tax credits can't be traded. You can just buy and sell them one time. They can't change hands. That's absolutely not true when it comes to the CDRs or the carbon offset market. And so I think the direct question is there a platform? Yeah, there are platforms. There's a couple of platforms out there. I'm more than glad if you want to contact me, I can direct you to a couple of them. But there are certainly platforms where those types of credits are trying to get exposure to buyers. From a market perspective, the CDR market is going to be vastly dependent on exactly what type of project and product you're working on. So if you said you had a direct air capture project, CDRs are a massive portion of the value chain, right? That is the economic project because they're going to far outstrip the tax credits in value. If I had a biofuels project, there may be significant value there. If I was attaching carbon capture equipment to a natural gas processing facility, there may be far less or no value there. So it really depends. But short answer, yes, there are platforms, and I'm glad to connect you in if you want to reach out.
Andrea, Zach, do you have anything else to add?
I think agree with Greg that for the biofuel-based CCS, we definitely can generate a CDR. That's another path to monetize our decarbonization value chain, which we are also exploring. Yeah.
And I'm afraid that's not my area of expertise.
This next question is posed to all of our speakers here. Can you shed some light on expected returns for tax equity financing, and possibly can you cover your experience and or what to watch for in power generation with carbon capture?
Again, I'll defer to Zach and Greg on that one because I am subsurface technologies.
Greg, you want to go first?
Sure, sure. That would first. Two different questions in there. I think one, Jordan, I think the last thing you said was kind of what's the role of carbon capture inside of power generation facilities. That's a tricky one, right? So a lot of that's going to depend on, well, it depends on so many factors, right? Zach appropriately talked about kind of the distance. We're talking about, hey, I'm closer to geology. In a closed system of economics, every inch, meter, mile of my piping is going to be a drag on project economics. So we can't just look at, well, what's the cost of capture? Because cost of capture is just one component, right? If I had an $85 credit, and let's say it only cost me $1 to capture, but it cost me $90 to move it, then my project doesn't make money. So you have to look at all of these together. So when I look at power generation, and I'm working on quite a number of them, they're absolutely not the same. Sometimes the power generation company needs to write a check. Sometimes they're getting a check. So it depends. Are projects moving forward in the space? Yes, certain projects absolutely are. But it's a delicate dance and a very integrated and coordinated process to make sure that the project economics work. Right. Second question is, well, what about returns? Same answer, largely. It is highly project specific. As an anecdote, though, Zach may either want to comment on this or not want to comment on it. But as an anecdote, if you look at tax equity generally, tax equity started in the wind and solar space, right? There's some rules in 2007 from the IRS that said, hey, this could work here, right? Where a financial partner puts in money and they get paid back through tax credits, depreciation, and maybe a little bit of cash. The returns on those projects, because there's been hundreds, maybe thousands of those done at this point, the document, the style, the returns are fairly well known, right? At some point over the past couple of years, it was saying maybe around a 7% after tax unlevered return to the tax equity. I think that's crept up. Maybe it's 7.5 to 8.5% now. That applies to wind and solar. That's not the same answer when you get outside of wind and solar. But again, highly specific to your project. So could you put a range on? Is it north of 10? Likely for many projects, it's north of 10%. But it's really going to depend on kind of the certainty and the quality of the project.
Yeah, I think for carbon capture for power generation, that depends very much on the type of project. If it's a new power plant, you probably with carbon capture will have to, you can take advantage of the depreciation components of the tax equity much better than probably our older plant.
Andrea, question for you here. You spoke in terms of a 50% reduction in footprint. Does that generate a 50% reduction in cost? And if
wish.
not, then how much?
Yeah, so it really comes down to the density. So in oil and gas, we are trying to reduce the footprint, but also maintain that high resolution. And what we're finding for time-lapse surveys is you may be if you have a good baseline, you may be able to go in with a sparser resolution survey when you do that time lapse. So the final cost savings is really going to depend on the nature of your reservoir and what you're trying to image. But some general guidelines for high resolution surveys are if it reduces 50% of the amount of cutting you need to do on a program, then whatever the cost of that portion of the program is, you're going to save 50% there. But if you're putting the same amount of equipment out, you're just deploying it in a different method, you wouldn't necessarily save a lot of money there, but we're seeing 10 to 15% savings on, let's say, the recording side of things, or the, just in general on the efficiencies.
Greg, this question goes to you. This attendee heard that Exxon is getting $120 /T. Oh my gosh, this is where my knowledge gap comes. So sorry. $120 /T for sequestration in Wyoming. Is this true? And if so, how are they doing this? And for my personal knowledge, what does /T mean?
Yeah, so it's per ton. Yeah, so
Okay,
probably
there you
per
go.
metric ton. Yeah,
Apologies.
yeah, I wouldn't be able to comment on a client or a specific project. I will say the cost to move a molecule and put the molecule down hole, I think, are slowly starting to come within range. But again, it's so project specific. So if we go back to, and I think I've given this example maybe a couple times on some of the other talks, but early stage requests for proposals, like where we were representing the carbon capture company, right? You go out and you'd say, hey, market, is there somebody who can move and put this molecule down hole for me? And if so, how much would you charge? And what are the risks, and what kind of indemnities and liabilities? What are you assuming, et cetera? And so early stage, and even up until maybe about a year and a half ago, we would go out and represent the capture companies, go out to the market, and in many cases, we were getting 20 to 30 responses from the market. So 20 to 30 RFP responses, which showed you there was a ton of companies in that transport and sequestration space, and they were pricing out what that cost would be. And so in some of the ones I've been on, maybe the low end was in the high teens per metric ton, and the high end was in the maybe $60 range, and that was kind of your range. So without commenting on a specific project, I think depending on the project, I'd say probably maybe around $20 per metric ton would be about the absolute lowest you could do it, and maybe up to in the 50s is probably the absolute highest that the market kind of would allow it. And you're going to see a ton of projects somewhere in the middle, right in the 30s, maybe low 40s. It's just really going to depend. It depends on how big the capacity is, how long I have to move the molecule. Am I the first project in a kind of a conglomerate or an amalgamated project? Is it a very point-to-point? Hey, I connect to Zach connects to a plant, and he's going to go 1.3 miles. Well, the cost there is going to be way cheaper than if I have to send it 50 miles to another site. So it's really hard to pinpoint on a project. We get this question a lot from over our non-US clients and even non-US EY people. They just call and say, hey, can you just send me a note how much this costs to capture and move and put a molecule down? And there's absolutely no way to answer that because it differs across the street, right? I could be on one side for anybody near Houston, or I guess anywhere in the south. I could be on the south side of I-10 versus the north side of I-10, and I could get a vastly different answer. One project could make wild economic sense, and the other project could make no economic sense at all. So, Jordan, I think that was a very long-winded way of answering that question, but hopefully I got there.
I think you did a fantastic job.
Okay.
I learned something new, and you didn't spill the beans on your specific client. So I think that's a win-win-win. Zach, this question's for you. You spent many years at Kinder Morgan working on CO2 gas and EOR wells. With the recent legislation creating the 45Q parity for EOR, how do you see this reshaping the role of CO2 EOR in the market?
Thanks for the question. For those of you know me, that I'm a big supporter of CO2 for EOR. I spent a lot of my previous years drilling CO2 wells for CO2 EOR for injectors, monitor, producers. So I just like to remind people that before, when the oil prices were high, there's a lot of EOR projects that can be done, and then there were actually not enough CO2. So CO2 was actually a scarce commodity in the oil field, particularly in the Permian Basin. I think when we capture the CO2, if you put your ideology aside, I think you use that to produce more oil to supply. As I mentioned earlier, that energy is good for humanity, improve quality of life. I think is probably a better use of CO2. So I'm fully support. I think with the new legislation, that's definitely going to help to move some of the CO2 be eventually being used for UR purpose. Obviously, doing UR has its own complexity. The MRV definitely going to be more complex because you're injecting CO2 and you're also taking out some CO2. So the monitoring process is a little bit more complex. However, I also see some limitation of CO2 EUR, particularly currently we do not have a very extensive CO2 pipeline to move the CO2 from where you can capture to where you can use that for EUR. I think that needs to come before we have a more CO2 EUR application. And another side is also the CO2 from capture plant and needs to be not actually will not be as stable as usually the natural source of CO2. So for EUR project, for those of you know that you need the CO2 supply to be very, very stable. You turn it down, the CO2 needs to come. You cannot just shut down your UR project for a couple of months, a couple of weeks because the capture plant cannot supply the CO2. That basically messes up the reservoir. On the other hand, also capture CO2, even with the 45Q parity, is still currently more expensive than what you can get with a natural CO2 source. So there still needs to be a little bit of economics to be worked out to use the capture CO2 for UR. But overall, I'm very positive that some of the CO2, hopefully more CO2 will be used for UR in the near future, not too far away.
Andrea, when would you recommend a VSP for plume tracking versus a 4D? And what is the thought process for that decision?
Well, I think that you need both as part of your baseline. Like you need a 3D as well as a VSP, but the VSP makes a very cost-effective tool for time lapse in the first few years of the project when the plume is still relatively close to the wellbore. So that is that's typically where we see it used. Of course, it is always valuable at any time in the project as well to get a really high resolution snapshot right around the wellbore, but there's a limit to how far you can see with a VSP related to the depth of the well and how much of the well is instrumented. I hope that answers your question.
Greg, this one's for you. The regulation risk seems high on these projects. Is that uncertainty delaying projects going forward?
No, not. I'd say no, not necessarily. I mean, you have two sets of risks, right? I mean, you have just compliance risk with existing regulations, statutes, et cetera, right? That's exactly what I'm talking about on 45Q compliance. And the longer part of the process isn't, I think the way the rules are set up now, it provides a decent amount of clarity. Pending this kind of how am I going to comply on the MRV side issue that I think it's going to work itself out in the next 2 months. The larger issue is just contractual risk, right? Because if you look at the parties involved, I have a capture company, I have an emitter, I have a transport company, and I have a downhole company. And if I look from the left of that value chain all the way to the right, if I'm the emitter, so I make a product, let's say it's ethanol or natural gas, I make some kind of saleable product, and then I give my CO2 to somebody else. Right. From my perspective, the moment I give you the CO2, it's kind of like I want that to be your problem, not mine, on anything that happens to it. Right. And the capture company gets it and it say, okay, well, I'm gonna capture, I'm gonna dehydrate and compress, and then I'm gonna move it to my fence line. And then the moment I get the fence line, I'm gonna give it to a midstream company, right? One of our pipeline folks. And from a capture company perspective, I'm gonna say the moment that gives to that fence line, I want that to be your problem, not mine, right? You're going to take title, custody, and it should be yours. And the pipeline person does the same thing. They say, hey, we know how to do throughput. We can move a molecule from point A to point B, but when I get to the sequestration company, the moment it gets there, that's your problem. It's not mine, right? And so you can't have 100% of the risk sitting on one person all the time. So the larger kind of, I wouldn't say risk, but the complexity in negotiating some of these is making sure that everybody's apprised of all the risks and you're appropriately sharing those in the right commercial manner for your project in your documents. So this issue on the regulatory side, Jordan, I think it's new, right? It's only 13 days old. People are trying to figure out what that could mean. I think you're going to get different answers for people doing EOR than they are permanent sequestration. It's something we're fielding calls on. I've probably had 40 or 50 calls on this in the past 12, 13 days. Yeah, it's not holding back projects though.
Okay, last question here. Do you anticipate that the extension of the larger credit to class 2 wells will result in fewer class 6 wells being proposed since the regulations on those seem to be more strict? The floor is open.
Yeah, sure. I'll do a quick one, and then I will stop talking. Probably heard enough of me already at this point. Yes and no. So, I mean, there's many projects. Well, let me say it this way. Some of it depends on your investor base. So when Zach's company or other companies go out and says we want to raise capital, there is an investor pool because obviously capital is global. There is a certain portion of your investor pool that will not invest in anything that says enhanced oil or natural gas recovery. They will invest in something that says permanent sequestration. So if that is the investor base that's attracted to your project, they're not going to move from a class 6 to a class 2 just because it's quicker, right? That's the class 6 and the permanent sequestration is fundamental to how they make money. The other piece, and Zach referenced this, is it's geologic and geographic specific too. It's not just as easy as saying, well, we'll just flip this into an EOR project because I can get a class 2 well. You actually have to have a class 2 type program. So on the margin, are you going to see some projects go class 2 instead of class 6? I do think you will see that. Is going to be a massive change in how the projects go down each one of the paths. Not necessarily. It's going to be investor specific, and it's definitely going to be geographic specific. Zach, Andrew, any thoughts there?
Greg answered that pretty well. I just want to add one more. I think currently a few class 2 based CCS project is being proposed or being developed, or one of them, I think one or two of them is in operating, is that they are focusing on natural gas processed CO2. So basically that's a quote unquote oil and gas related CO2 gas can be used for class 2 well. So I think they are doing that mainly because they want to get the project move forward quicker and get into injection, get a 45Q tax credit earlier. I think most of them, as far as I know, they were building the well to the standard of class 6 wells. So there's really no difference in the way they actually drilling the well, building the well, and they're doing this with the intention of eventually converting those class 2 wells into class 6 wells to accommodate CO2 molecules from other sources out of oil and gas related activities.
Very good. Look, I'm going to jump in now. I have been conspicuous by my absence, although I did ask some questions. I want to thank all of the attendees out in Radio Land for coming once again to our forum. This is our 9th forum. Jordan's just turned off her camera. Don't go away, Jordan. I want to thank you for releasing me from the angst of having to act as chair today. It's allowed me to sit back and drink my coffee and enjoy the presentations. And I have enjoyed the presentations very much. Zach, Andrea, Greg, thank you for your insights on an area that and I know most of the people out in the world are interested. It seems to be an on again, off again, and very complicated. Greg, when you start talking about all the various regulations and way of trading these credits and the different kinds of credits and things, I want to say, boy, I would really need somebody like you on my team to make sure I was making money on this project. Andrea, I kind of understand what you do. We're geophysicists. Zach, I've been close to where you are, but Greg, man, you're the kind of guy I got to pay extra for. I don't know. It's difficult. Folks out in Radio Land, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation as much as I have. I want to remind you that we're going on forward with this. We're having such fun with this program and learning, and people are showing up every month. By the dozens, more than dozens. We had close to 60 people this week. So next week we have a geothermal panel who are going to talk about something that again is very exciting and topical these days, where we're talking about the ongoing developments of the geothermal and particularly the enhanced geothermal world, FERVO and Mazama are out in front, bringing these new projects on board. And we have a geophysicist from Lawrence Berkeley who's been helping with the monitoring of the Fervo project, talk a little bit about what they're seeing as they create these heat exchange chambers below ground. Then Andrea is going to come back and talk to us about some innovations in seismic acquisition. She'll expand on what she's showed us a little bit of a teaser today and tell us a lot more. And we're already starting to line up talks for next year. And so I hope you will continue to watch. There is a movie, a recording of all the talks we've presented so far on our webpage. And on that webpage, you can also find a QR code, or I'm going to show it now, I think, where you can register for our next talk. We'd like to have an idea of how many people are attending and what your interests are so that we can use that to direct the costs that or the talks that we make for the future. So with that, I'm going to say thanks again to Jordan. Thanks again to the panel for taking the time to prepare these talks. Thanks to all of you out there in Radioland who've spent an hour with us this morning, and I hope to see you again next month. Bye for now.
Thanks.